Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic for you today. Let's do it. People who have known a killer. Did you ever suspect that they would be? What happened? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
100%. I had a coworker who went from being a really smart and cultured guy to having wild ideas about catching STDs from working with coworkers who didn't have infectious diseases that I was aware of, and started getting really aggressive with certain people. One day he came in and started taking pictures of the people he had been aggressive with, the last one being me. I told my boss I wasn't going to continue working there if he was, that he made me feel threatened, and I was sure those pictures were for some kind of kill list. She let him go, and after speaking with her boss, we decided to close the store because he seemed like the kind of guy that would come back and do something. I never saw him again, but Googled him every so often because I just knew he was going to end up in the news one day. About 5 years later, he shot up a hospital. Among the evidence found in his home were lists and photos of the people he wanted to kill. It turned out he had schizophrenia and went off his meds a few months after we started working together. I was absolutely stunned to learn that my older brother's friend from high school, who was the nicest, friendliest house guest when he was over, ended up murdering his 2 kids years later. He was like a second older brother to us younger kids and lived with us for a while they were some family issues on his side. We used to meet up for a week every spring with 2 couples. One of the couples were old college friends, and the other couple were co-workers of theirs. We really liked them and their 2 young children. We got together for several years. Subsequently, we received a call informing us that a hammer had killed the wife in their basement. Police expertly cleaned the scene and focused on the husband, a nurse. He ended up injecting himself with something to dull the pain, and then stabbed himself in the heart. We never suspected he was capable of something like this, and we don't know why he did it. I hope the kids turned out okay. Know a woman, my friend's ex-wife. She accidentally killed a cyclist while driving. I don't believe her story at all. She says she sneezed and hit him, but they were in a residential area where the speed limit was 15 miles per hour, near a school, and the extent of the injuries doesn't make sense for what she says happened. She's effing crazy. She is prone to emotional outbursts, tantrums, and speeding when angry. Just unstable as hell. After this man's death, she posted on social media about how traumatized she was, how she survived, and how she wanted to set an example of a strong woman for her kids. Never mentioned that she killed someone. Never expressed remorse or sadness or condolences for his family. And when pressed, she just cries and plays victim and blames him for coming out of nowhere. We think she was arguing on the phone and speeding home. I was a server at a diner, and one of the regulars, Johnny, was a quiet and aloof guy. He was a little slow, but well-mannered and kind. He knew the menu well, and he knew what he liked. One day, he casually mentioned his dad was the original owner of the diner and that he himself used to work there. After he left, another regular told me he was shocked Johnny brought up his dad, considering he had stabbed his dad to death in a crack and alcohol-induced psychosis. I was floored. It ended up being a very well-known case when it had happened. He had gotten out of jail and was under heavy psychological supervision, understandably. My ex-fiancé was violent with me on the night of our engagement party, and I honestly thought he was going to kill me. No one believed me when I told them. No one believed he'd even be capable of hurting me in that way. I'd been abused in other ways before, emotionally, verbally, etc., and he'd slapped me or pushed me from time to time, but that was the first and only heavily violent incident where I was being properly beaten. But his eyes, they were different that night, like there was nothing behind them at all. 8 years later, literally exactly 8 years later, to the day, after marrying the woman he cheated on me with and having a baby together, he murdered them both and is now locked away and pending trial. He fatally stabbed them, fled to a different city, and spent 2 days in a hotel before surrendering himself. Only after he was in custody did we discover the bodies he had left in the house. I can't imagine the scene, and the whole event really shook up our town and community. I thought it was a dream until his face hit the news and my phone blew up. I found out the day he turned himself in, and as it happens, I'd just arrived for a brief holiday in the same city that he'd just turned himself in at. It fills me with chills. It ended up being incredible timing, as I was able to give my statement directly to the detectives that interviewed my ex and ask any questions I needed or wanted for closure. I had so many messages and calls apologizing for not believing me back then, many saying they're so grateful I got away from him, as that could have been me. My mom called me crying her eyes out and so thankful she still has me. It was so weird. I felt so numb. I'm glad people finally are acknowledging my trauma now. Oh, she's dead. After all these years, it's helping with closure and healing. But it was hard going through that season of the breakup feeling very alone. And people treated me like I was the crazy ex at the time for voicing what had happened to me in that relationship. I was shocked. This was a woman I'd let hold my child, was best friends with my sister-in-law, came to all the family parties, and we'd always had a wonderful time when I saw her. She was the caretaker for her mom with Alzheimer's, and I think she must have had some sort of mental problem going on for a while because she smothered her mom and has special charges for elder abuse and the crime involving excellent violence. The police found her wandering the streets, pleading with strangers to kill me. Upon calling the police, they returned to her residence and found that her mother had passed away approximately a week ago. She had been texting and calling friends, talking about sports, etc., like nothing was amiss while living in the house with her dead mom in the other room, until the day she went out and asked people to kill her. I later found out she had also randomly attacked a friend while they were hanging out a few months before she murdered her mom. She was just laughing and having drinks, and the next thing the friend knew, the woman was on top of her, trying to strangle her. I was friends with a kid in high school who ended up killing the wrestling coach by shooting him in the chest and burying him under cement in the basement. It turned out the guy was molesting him and his friends. It's been 20 plus years. He's still in prison and was 18 when it happened. He came from a broken home with no one to protect him. The wrestling coach was hailed as a great guy, but really he was a predator preying on young men in poverty. Glad the world is rid of him, but sad. My friend was the child who made the call. I had a friend group online for a couple of years, and someone invited a friend of theirs into the group chat. The shy child appeared insignificant in comparison to the rest of us in our late 20s. Someone I was closer to in the group talked to me about him. He said he was lonely and was probably dealing with some heavy stuff. He could use a friend or maybe an older male role model. All I knew about this guy's interest was that he liked anime. So I hit him up. We made small talk about anime. He recommended me Food Wars. I watched some of it that night before going to bed really late. I woke up to texts around noon the following day from my friend who told me to check the news. There was a mass shooting in Ohio, sad, gut-wrenching even. And then I saw who did it. It was the lonely anime guy, the Dayton, Ohio shooter, Connor Betts, recommended me Food Wars, all casual-like, and told me to let him know what I think about it. He then woke up the next day and went on a shooting spree. It never occurred to me that I was trading anime recommendations with a potential mass shooter. He died in the shootout with cops. The whole thing was insanely surreal. Growing up towards the end of elementary school, I would stay the night with a friend. His parents were always fighting, and numerous times his dad said he was going to kill his mother. His mother dared him to do it every time. While it was still a shock, it wasn't really a surprise when he actually did it. I was in high school. His dad murdered his mother, then went into the police station and told him what he did. The story was filled with sadness and heartbreak. Later on, my friend, who I hadn't spoken to in a long time, committed suicide. I don't know how his siblings are doing. By chance, I ran into his brother at one point while partying. While he seemed sort of self-destructive with drugs and alcohol, I don't think he was suicidal. Given all that trauma, it's not surprising that he sought to numb himself. No small wonder the guy sought to numb himself. I worked with a woman and her adult daughter for about 6 months before I found out they had both gone to prison for teaming up to murder their husband/father. It wasn't surprising because they had rough lives, but they were petite and friendly, so it was somewhat surprising. A guy I used to go to school with, then very occasionally a drinking partner, killed a squatty in the pub we had been drinking in. Apparently, the squatty had touched Paul's girlfriend up, and Paul politely asked him to stop. The squatty pulled them apart and threw them out. Once they were outside, the squatty pulled out a blade. Paul took it off him, then stabbed him 8 times. We picked him up in Dover the following morning. I knew he had a fiery temper, but it was unacceptable. Was sentenced to involuntary manslaughter and got 8 years, out in 3. Yes, a relative of mine is a murderer. He was in prison for setting his house on fire with his wife and kids inside, and he assaulted his girlfriend in the same time frame because she was pregnant. He gets out, and his new girlfriend's daughter just disappears. I remember I was talking to a different relative and said Bob did it. That is not his name. They reprimanded me and advised me not to make such a statement after he had recently been released and completed his sentence. Well, guess what, Reddit? It was Bob. 2 of my friends killed a 3rd friend of mine. I still can't wrap my head around it all these years later. You might have read about this somewhere. It was big news. My friend was Ron Baker, Duncan Martinez, and Nathan Blaylock. God, I've typed things out 5 times. It's sort of hard to know what to say, but I will say this. The most shocking thing is that Duncan and Nathan sat with all of us, worried about Ron when he was just missing, and cried and mourned when he was found dead. It was the worst betrayal. You feel ashamed that you knew them, that you should have somehow known. It's irrational, I know, and I and another of our group of friends have endlessly talked about this over the years. How could we have been friends with someone who could do something like that? I never even considered it a possibility. We worked together. He lived a few blocks away. He and his wife had an infant, and he had a daughter from a previous relationship. His wife worked second shift for 911. Sometimes he would call me and ask for help or just have someone around. We were 22-ish. I'm 43 now. I didn't hear from him for a couple of months, and we were no longer working together. He calls me one day and tells me his infant passed away from SIDS. It was maybe a month or 2 after. He was unusually calm, and it resonated with me. He started fundraising for SIDS awareness. It became his whole personality, which seemed understandable at the time. One day I was out Christmas shopping. My phone wasn't working right. I had a ton of missed calls from him, but I didn't feel like calling him back. He called me again later that night and left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it. The next day the news is on behind me. As they described this horrific event, I couldn't help but think, that sounds like Steve. I turned around as they put up his mugshot. I listened to his voicemail. He asked me to call him and said something bad had happened to his daughter. He beat and strangled his 4-year-old to keep her from her mother. He confessed to suffocating the baby as well. Over the last 20 years, I have considered writing him a lot and asking why he kept calling me, but I never have. He seemed like a sweet guy. I never felt unsafe around him. I was in my home alone with him often and never felt uneasy. It seemed like he loved his children. I actually do know a guy who killed someone. 2 guys jumped him as he was walking back to his hotel in Vegas where he had won a few $1,000s. After receiving a stab wound to the leg, he took the man's life and fatally stabbed him. He only spent the night answering questions at the police station without facing any charges. About 10 years ago, a guy was brutally murdered for snitching to cops, tied and gagged, taken to the middle of nowhere, 2x4 to the teeth in a small town. Such incidents are uncommon. The rumor was cops knew who did it, but didn't have the evidence to prove it. Cut to about 2 years ago, my brother, niece, and I are eating dinner when he told me who it was. A kid my age who sat beside me every single class I had. At the time of the murder, we were in 10th grade. I've known 2. One was a kid a few years younger than me. He was the younger brother of a girl I went to middle school with, and I knew him casually. We had a few mutual friends and hung out in a group a few times as tweens and teens. I remember him as a kid and kind of a wise ass. I was definitely surprised 10 years later when I learned he had killed his stepfather. I think it might have been an abuse self-defense situation, but I don't remember for sure. I didn't have any idea that he had that kind of home life, but I didn't know him well enough to where I would. Another was a guy I worked with as a teen into my 20s. I worked as a loader and unloader in a shipping warehouse where my father was a driver. One of the other loaders was an older man who I later learned had done 10 years in prison for the death of a police officer when he was younger. I never really got the full story, but always wondered why he wasn't still in prison. Maybe he was only tangentially involved. I heard stories of him having a temper, but I mostly got along with him. We weren't friends, but I cracked jokes and swapped stories the same with him as I did with the other guys. I've known several other people that I could imagine taking a life more easily than those two guys. When I was in 4th grade, there was a boy who kept trying to be friends with me. I'm male, by the way. But he made me nervous, and I tried to avoid him because something about him was just off. He always complimented me, not in the way that friends might do, but more like someone with an unhealthy obsession with a celebrity would. I was not cool in 4th grade. I was a shy, awkward nerd who preferred to be alone. Also, if I got interested in something, he would copy me and then suddenly get interested in the same thing. He was very creepy. And after 4th grade, I switched to another school for unrelated reasons and never heard from him again. That is until I was in high school, when there was a shocking local news story about a high school kid who shot and killed both his parents and his older brother. Yep. So I guess I could tell that there was something wrong with him, but I didn't suspect he would kill his family. I didn't know him, but my great-grandfather went to prison for attempted murder. I found out about it when I was doing genealogical research and saw newspaper articles about it. Apparently, when he was very young, I think maybe 17 or 19, he became involved with a much older married woman who convinced him that her husband was horribly abusing her and that she was in fear for her life and asked for his help. She made homemade candy for her husband laced with arsenic that my great-grandfather had purchased for her at her request. She was caught after her husband survived the poisoning, and then she set up my great-grandfather. She cooperated with the police by asking him to buy more arsenic. He was arrested when he arrived with it at her home. The news story said that she had written a message on a note to accompany the candy she made for her husband, and I can't remember exactly what she wrote, but it was pretty eerie if you took into account that the candy was poisoned. Something like, "I can't wait for you to try this candy. The candy is truly irresistible." It struck me that she was a bad, possibly sociopathic person who had likely misled my young, naive, love-struck great-grandfather into thinking he was saving her from a desperate situation. She somehow got off scot-free, and my great-grandfather went to prison for 8 years. My father, who's a very religious and honestly incredibly wonderful and inspiringly moral person, loved my great-grandfather deeply. When I discovered the story and asked my dad if he knew, he said he did, but found out about it later in life. It had not changed his opinion of the man, whom he continued to believe was a wonderful person. He always described my great-grandfather as a loving and gentle person, someone who was particularly kind. Had I been a boy, I would have had his first name.
So now here's the moral dilemma. Now, your great-grandfather facilitated in what would ultimately be an attempted murder. So is he the instrument of the act or simply a vessel? If he knew what it was for, coerced by someone, that's a real gray area. So I don't know. I would probably subscribe to think that, yes, if he lived his life the way he did, maybe there is some grace there. But again, considering if it was your family member on the receiving end of the arsenic, it may be difficult. So it's perspective. But I think it's definitely more in the hands of his former lover / that man's ex-wife. And your great-grandfather was simply a means to an end of a manipulative person. So, tough one.
My childhood best friend and I have a lot in common, as we were each only children who lived with our single mothers in the same apartment complex. My parents were divorced, his were only separated. One year his parents got back together, and he moved away to live in a real house. I was sad and a little angry, but too young to fully understand why. I went to his house for sleepovers sometimes, and when his dad, who was also my soccer coach, came home from work, he was an absolute terror. He wasn't drunk, but he was always just boiling over with rage. My friend seemed unfazed and told me it was normal. I believed him. His dad scared me at night, but in the mornings, he was just my soccer coach again. One day, my mom was reading the paper and found the obituary of my friend's mom. We knew nothing about what happened, but went to the funeral. My friend was there and was utterly in shock, barely responsive. His dad was also there and explained when asked about his wife's death that it had been a tragic fire. He said it with, and I'm not exaggerating for narrative effect, a manic glint in his eye. It was blood-chilling. He was arrested days later after forensics found traces of accelerant in the basement where the fire started, as well as on his wife's body and his own socks. The wife was found to have suffered a massive blow to the head prior to the fire, but died of smoke inhalation, and so was still alive when the fire started. Despite facing murder charges, my friend's dad managed to secure bail and a $250,000 bond with the assistance of his parents. He then attempted to fake his own death and fled to the West Coast to live under an assumed identity. America's Most Wanted featured him in the story of his wife's murder, leading to his capture, rearrest, and extradition. The court tried him, found him guilty of second-degree murder, and sentenced him to 25 years in prison. He was released on parole after serving 12 years. His parole has since ended, and he's now an ex-con but a free man. He has always claimed it was an accident, that he killed his wife, and that he started the fire only because he knew no one would believe it was an accident. And he's right. I don't believe it for a second. He killed her for the life insurance policy and didn't think he'd get caught because he's a narcissistic sociopath. I hope the rest of his life is filled with pain and loneliness. This guy remarries my husband's aunt. He comes into our home and takes a seat on our stairs. I was on the couch, and just his face and body language felt off. I felt very uneasy every time I was alone with him. My mother-in-law goes to visit them in their townhouse away, and this guy kept telling hubby's aunt that mother-in-law was a negative influence. What would the church think if they saw you at the bar together? Well, it turns out that the bar could have potentially saved my mother-in-law's life. Hubby's aunt ended up getting drunk as a skunk while they were hanging out. Can't remember where her husband was at the bar, and she let it spill. He was a convicted felon. His crime? He had strangled his girlfriend to death. He only served 10 years, after which they released him. As soon as my mother-in-law found that out, she dipped out of there. Didn't even tell them she was leaving that night. My husband and I were wondering why she came home so early from her trip, until she told us that. On the bright side, he ended up dying a few years later. LOL. My bio dad beat a guy to death because he asked for some money. I have a news clipping with a photo of him from the front page of the LA Times, shirtless, covered in blood, being arrested by 2 cops right afterwards. It happened the day after I was born. He was walking around Glendale looking for a job in the middle of the day, and a drunk panhandler started giving him shit, demanding some money. I guess he flipped out and just went berserk on the guy. Nothing happened. He spent a night in jail, and they let him go. It turned out the guy he killed was already dead. He had faked his own death years ago. He was a known local nuisance to the LA Sheriff's Department. No one will talk about it. My sister and I suspect that the DA and sheriff figured that he just did them a favor, so they called it self-defense and let it go. He was always adept at sweet-talking his way out of anything. That is the only homicide that my sister and I have been able to confirm. However, he has bragged about others to us, but we think he was lying, because that is what he does. He was recounting a story to me about how he had to kill his cellmate during his time in San Quentin due to the warden's refusal to place him in his own cell. Upon pressing him for further details, it became evident to me that he was fabricating the story. He probably got into a fight with his cellmate, but exaggerated it to impress, scare, or whatever. There are other stories of his that tell of his violent escapades. My sister would find them in old news clippings or police reports around SoCal. We do know that he was very capable of violence. When I was a child, he would occasionally have visitation rights to see me in between his prison stints. When he was around, things could quickly turn sour. I never looked forward to his visits. Surprisingly, his visits often surpassed the quality of our current housing. This was primarily due to their constant state of disorder and chaos. I'm now switching gears. I didn't know this killer, but I thought I would throw it that there. A friend of mine, an ex-coworker from a previous job, is from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She worked with serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. She told me that he was creepy. She is a bit younger than he was. That was when he was killing people. Yikes. Even thinking about him makes me feel nauseous. Dude, when I had my second child, we were a part of a small group at our church. We were all pretty close. We would pass our baby around and everyone would take turns snuggling her while we talked once a week. I trusted them. Feeling safe, I would have asked any of them to babysit my 2 under-2s. One woman in particular stood out as mysterious. She often referenced something awful in her past, and it was clear the leader of the group knew what she was referring to, but it was never shaped or shared with the rest of us. Well, my husband was looking up something else on the internet when he stumbled across what this secret was. She had killed her own newborn in the throes of postpartum depression. I never went back to that group or that church. I was furious that their leader was allowing her to cuddle my newborn without bothering to inform me that she had killed herself. I'm still angry about this when I think about it, and it's been almost 17 years. Absolute bullshit. We had a right to know that. I really didn't suspect he'd kill someone, but I did pick up fast that he was dangerous. His devilishly handsome appearance always made me cautious. Then he just proved to be a real asshole, and I stopped moving in his circle. He had a best friend and a good buddy, Michael, whom I really liked, and I invited him to my New Year's Eve party in 2009 and 2010. Michael was a charismatic presence at the party. He was just a solid good dude. I didn't get their friendship. 2 months later, Michael's friend shot and killed him. It was truly heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. The murderer has already served his time and escaped. Not sure exactly what happened. I have no desire to discover the truth. Rest in peace, Michael. I've personally known 2 individuals who have committed suicide. One of them was a shock, the other one not so much. The first one I knew was the guy I went to school with. He was a senior when I was a freshman, and was on the football team with me. It was a small town, so everybody knew everybody and were all pretty close. So even though he was a few grades ahead, we still knew each other quite well. Now this guy had been held back a year or 2 and had already done a short stint in county for assault. He was a nice guy most of the time, but he also had a really short fuse and would flip out at the slightest offense and start throwing fists. I watched him get arrested at football practice for violating his probation when he didn't like that he got tackled and started throwing fists and ended up splitting one of our teammates' lips in half with his class ring. Anyway, a year or 2 after he graduated from high school, I learned from a friend that he had been in and out of trouble for breaking into houses, businesses, and other things. However, his troubles came to an end when he got into a squabble with someone on the beach. They got into a fight. Then he went to his car, retrieved a bat, and beat the guy to death with it. What's the most remarkable aspect of this story? He only spent about 10 years in prison, and he has been free for about a decade now. Now, this is the shocking one. This kid was several years younger than me. He was the son of one of my dad's tenants and lived next door to us. Very sweet-natured kid when I knew him. His dad worked at one of the plants and his mom was a homemaker. The kid came over to watch my dad and me restore my Mustang. He was probably 8 or so at the time. He was a good kid, always asking questions, showing great respect, and believing that the car and us were the coolest. Mom was a little crazy, so I wasn't surprised to learn that the parents got divorced shortly after I graduated high school and went their separate ways. I didn't hear anything about that family for a handful more years after that. I'm on a local community forum at the time, and I see a news report posted about the kid. Apparently he was 15 years old and staying with his mom, who had taken a job as a live-in caretaker for a non-aid generation on hospice. He wanted to go and visit his girlfriend, but his mom refused to take him, and an argument ensued. He was not happy about this. He waited until his mom fell asleep, retrieved a hammer, and bashed her brains in with it. He then stole a bunch of pills, stole the old man's car, and drove like an hour or so away to his girlfriend's house, where he spent the evening taking pills and effing his girlfriend. He ended up ODing on the pills and going to the hospital in a coma. When he came to, the police were waiting for him because they'd found his mom, and he confessed. I think he has like a 50-year sentence or something like that. He will be absent for an extended period. I knew Aileen Wuornos when I was a kid. I wasn't friends with her, but we used to see her and her girlfriend walking around and were told not to talk to her because she was crazy. My dad's friend paid her for S a few times, but he was probably kind to her. I saw her on the side of the road with a single-shot lever-action .22. She said she was trying to kill a snake, but couldn't get the rifle to work. I instructed her on how to load the rifle, and I fired it into the bushes, feigning to see a snake. But in reality, my intent was to fire the weapon. I remember she looked pretty rough, but her girlfriend was somewhat okay. The girlfriend wouldn't make eye contact with me. I remember thinking, this lady is crazy. After that one encounter, years later I saw the movie but only caught it midway through, and I knew exactly who it was before I even saw her name on the name of the city she operated in. She was a mixed bag of victim and crazy lady. There was a lot of evil in that area in the 80s.